And I'm the head of planning and environmental law at Mitchell. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Keith Mitchell, who is one of the leading environmental lawyers in the UK, and Greg from Yamazaki Mazak, who's a senior manager of European sales at the organisation, which is based in Worcester. Sustainability, net zero, carbon neutral, climate change, biodiversity, etc. are all key themes of today's world, and we're constantly being reminded about the need to protect the environment from our actions and the resulting impact on climate change and the increase in global temperatures. But this can seem quite overwhelming as to what is required by businesses and what they can, should, or could be doing to protect both the environment and the long-term success of the operation. By the end of today's session, hopefully you will understand the reporting requirements for businesses, why these are important, and how to put them into practice. But before we begin the session, please can you keep your cameras off, stay on mute until the Q&A session. And if you are keen to answer a question, please feel free to put it into the chat. If we don't pick those up during the talks, we will come back to them during the Q&A. And enjoy. Over to Keith.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good morning, everybody. We really appreciate you taking time out for an environmental law session. Just to introduce myself, I'm a new boy at Irwin Mitchell. I've only been here just under 4 months. And in a previous job, one of my roles was to review new environmental legislation. It was for a charity called Groundwork, and they had a legislation updating service. So they wanted a lawyer to basically check that their summaries were correct. And it was a pretty boring task, to tell you the truth, because you might have a new piece of environmental legislation about reducing smoke from residential areas, or designating a particular lake, you know, in Scotland. So it definitely didn't apply to most people. Then you had the consultations, the government response to the consultations. You have devolved government with 4 different countries doing it slightly differently. And then, of course, you had the EU legislation. Now, in simple terms, the EU has been fantastic for environmental protection through legislation, and the UK leaving has put a bit of a strain on that. But I'm going to mention 2 laws today that basically kind of change everything. It's not often in environmental law that a few laws turn up and basically you have to reevaluate pretty much everything you do. And that's 2 European laws that impact UK companies, even though we've left. So Melanie, could you go on to the next slide, please? Now, I'm going to be speaking for probably about 20 minutes, and then Craig's going to effectively talk about a similar topic, but how he's put it in practice. So it should work very well. But just to kind of visualize this, the main topic that we're going to cover today is all about climate and ESG reporting. Now, when I was first qualified as an environmental lawyer, I was all my boss said, "What is it you want to do in your job, Keith?" And I said, "Well, to tell you the truth, I want to work closely with companies, make sure, basically use the law, whatever way, to help them make environmental improvements." And he said, "Well, maybe you're in the wrong industry. You should be an environmental consultant." But so I qualified as an environmental consultant so I could walk around manufacturing sites, but also give legally privileged reports that normal consultants can't do. But when I said my message 30 years ago, you know, reduce waste, reduce water, improve this, etc., it was really only the manufacturing companies that got it. And the main reason you got it was obviously it saved you costs. But pretty much most other sectors were saying, that's nice to know, but no thanks. Our main thing is generating more turnover. All of that is changing with mandatory reporting. Basically, warts and all, companies have to disclose not just their environmental performance, which could have been, getting a ISO 14000 management standard. It's actually carbon reporting in their annual accounts or ESG reporting. Mostly companies have done it voluntarily to say, oh, look how good we are on the environment. But there's a load of, well, I would not lies, but massaging the truth a little bit, trying to make companies look better than they are. But these pieces of legislation that you'll see on the screen here, first of all, in the UK, it effectively was mandatory reporting for really big companies. So there's a slide even before this that applied to the very large companies that had 50 million pounds turnover. And then in the Energy and Carbon Report Regulations 2018, that brought it down to 36 million pound turnover and 250 employees. So it cut a lot more people. But both that and the 2002 regulations basically said, yeah, Scope 3 is optional. Now, we're going to talk about Scope 3 in a minute. It's about your whole value chain. But then the EU said, no, in practice, people are already monitoring Scope 3 emissions, your supply chain, etc. So they've brought in mandatory reporting, and it's only started this year, on January 1st January 2024, with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I'm going to come on to that later because it's very, very important. But the other thing I noticed, going back to my first point about environmental improvements, nice to have, but not a top priority. I'm now attending several meetings where all they talk about is ESG. And the main reason for that is, for the first time ever, the international accounting community have done a link between profit and environmental protection. And in June last year, they issued the IFRS sustainability standards for both ESG and a separate one for climate. So that's the big picture. Basically, as a result of these laws, you have mandatory reporting. And because everybody's now watching you, it's your investors, it's your staff, it's your competitors, everyone really has to step up their action. Next slide, please, Melanie. So just before I go on to that, I'll do a quick tour of some of the other new pieces of legislation or developments that you'll probably notice in practice. Now, as you know, there's upper tier and lower tier waste carriers. So you can move your own waste with, between your different properties in the UK, or you can actually transport and dispose other people's waste, and you have to register online. And the enforcement of that wasn't great. But if you think about the waste duty of care, it's one of the main challenges for the Environment Agency. So they have decided to bring the whole waste carrier regime within the environmental permitting controls. Now, it's not enforced yet. The legislation is expected this year. But if you want to know how this impacts your particular business, if you do a search for the DEFRA response in October 2023, at the back of that, it looks at different scenarios of transporting, holding, disposing of waste, and you can see which one will apply to you, so you can be prepared in advance. A more cynical look at this is the EA will get lots of additional application and subsistence fees, but the main reason they're doing it is because you will now need a permit just to be a waste carrier, and they call it waste controllers and waste transporters. That means that all of this strict legislation and a wide array of enforcement powers will be in the hands of the EA. So we can expect to see greater regulation of that particular part. That'll be tied in to the whole change of waste tracking, when waste transfer notes and consignment notes, I think, will be put to bed, and everything will be all online, so it'll be easier to catch the bad boys, the fly tip, etc. Now, as part of the enforcement powers, obviously the EA doesn't want to take everybody to court, and with civil sanctions, they've got a couple of. They thought they had a few things that were really useful. One was a fixed penalty notice, but actually that's more a slap on the wrist and not much in the way of high fines. But variable monetary penalties, in theory, could have been a really useful thing for them, but just the way they were introduced, it didn't apply to the main EPR offences, and they had a £250,000 cap. They have removed that now. So you will see, if you fall foul of environmental legislation, rather than starting the official prosecution procedure, etc., they will go straight to variable monetary penalties, and it's uncapped. So that is a big new power for the EA. The third main change this year is the extended producer responsibility for packaging regulations. Now, we have a team of 14 English planning environmental lawyers. If you include the Scots, with 17 in the team, and we have a lady that just specialises in this. And I've actually taken this from her talk last week. If anybody wants to see it, we can send you the recording. But I'm sure most of you in your roles in manufacturing are very aware of the packaging regulations. From an environmental lawyer point of view, doing due diligence and transactions, it's quite easy, because if you're a member of an approved compliance scheme, you basically they guarantee you compliance, and you just have to pay their fees, etc. But there was a threshold of £2 million and 50 tons of packaging, so it only caught the big boys, and I'm sure a lot of the people on the call are caught within the packaging waste thresholds. They've now brought these new obligations to record and report on data in particular circumstances, and I'll come on to this in the next slide, but it applies to a wider range of companies, so £1 million turnover and 25 tons packaging. It's harder for the small organisations because they will not be members of approved compliance schemes, so they have to do all of this hassle compliance, and eventually it's been delayed, the fees for it, but eventually there'll be fees. The last thing to mention, which falls into the energy camp, is ESOS, which is energy efficiency reporting, really. Phase 3 was postponed, delayed, so you've got up to the 5th of June if you haven't submitted your Phase 3 ESOS report. Next slide, please, Melanie. So staying on this, the data collection stuff. First of all, if you look at the table to the right, if you do any of those packaging type services, and then to the left, you're above that threshold of 1 million and 25 tons. That's what you have to do. Then there'll be a fee that's delayed. If you need detailed guidance on that, the Gov UK site sets it out very clearly, both for large organisations and small organisations. If you follow that, you will go wrong. Next slide, please. So, as I said at the start, we wanted the main bits that we're going to cover today to be about climate. Just the big picture on that. If you look, this is the World Economic Forum. They do this report every year, and they look at what's the biggest thing that will impact business around the world. And short-term misinformation, cyber insecurity, all of this geopolitical upheaval and the impacts on the world economy, they're the big issues. When you get to 10 years, though, it's actually, we can run out of resources and the climate is going to go berserk, and that will change everything. And that's why they're putting in all of this legislation now. Next slide, please. These next slides will just cover in about 5 seconds. This first one is the climate, getting very, very hot. Next slide. The second one is biodiversity. Used to have lots of it, we'll soon have none. So really big issues here. That's a very general overview of a very detailed and complex topic. Next slide. So going back to the mandatory reporting, as I say, in the UK, the big companies had to do it first, actually back in 2013. So they'll have their accountants doing all of this mandatory reporting. They'll have their environmental and sustainability consultants. And then, as I say, from 2018, it came down to the lower tier, but still large companies. And then this new thing in 2022, we've got a new way of reporting and disclosing climate. You have to look at risks and opportunities. Next slide, please. Now, that was the UK. That was the mandatory bit. But basically, everybody knows what's going on at these COP conferences. And within the industries, they say, right, we all have to do net zero 50% by 2030, 100% by 2050. So let's actually set our own targets. And the main organization, it's a voluntary thing, but you have to pay a lot of money. It's the Science Based Target Initiative. Your company may already be part of this, certainly in your supply chain, or some of the bigger customers or clients will be signed up to this. And as part of that, you must cover Scope 3 emissions. So industry was moving to this even before the law. Next slide, please. So that's the voluntary bit. Now, when I say Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, Scope 2 is pretty easy, purchased electricity. That means if you change the source of your electricity to 100% renewable, you can cut out your Scope 3. It's all about reducing the numbers on each of these columns. The hardest one, of course, is Scope 3, the stuff out of your control, notoriously difficult to get the information for and make it accurate. And Craig's going to talk about that in a bit. Next slide. Looking at Scope 3, it gets very, very complicated. Greenhouse gas protocol sets out the different types. I think there's 15 different types, depending on your particular business. Not all of them may apply. Some of them will be more important than others. Next slide, please. So just out of interest, we're a big company that had mandatory carbon reporting, but also we see it as an opportunity. So the first thing, Irwin Mitchell had to get their own house in order. So they had to set targets. So normally, world governments, etc., are going for 250. The more progressive companies are trying to go a bit sooner. So 2040, we're saying we're committing to reaching net zero across our whole value chain by 2040. And you'll see the different stages there. Next slide, please. And every industry is different, but can you imagine, in a law firm, we give a lot of advice. We don't buy a lot of stuff apart from, computers and all the stuff in the office. And business travel and employee commuting is the big thing. So Scope 3 is actually, for your typical law firm, 97%. That's where all of our focus is for our environment sustainability team internally. Next slide. So I promised I would speak really about two particular pieces of EU legislation, because we all need to know about it. As I said right at the start, there's some pieces of legislation come along and they're much more important than others. This one effectively brings in mandatory ESG reporting. Now, the banks, the lenders, the really large listed companies, etc., have been having to do ESG reporting for the last 15 years, but it hadn't really impacted others. So what this EU piece of legislation does, a couple of things. One is the phased approach. From the 1st of January, the really large EU companies, and in certain circumstances, you could have a UK parent that's included in this, are subject to this mandatory reporting from 2024. But more than that, they have to comply with this thing called the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. That includes Scope 3, so that is now mandatory. So that is a huge change. So mandatory Scope 3 reporting for the big boys in Europe. Then phased approach, as I say, every year it covers more people. So this is the large companies with 40 million euros, 250 employees. You can see how it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, 2028 ESG data will then apply to third country undertakings above a certain threshold, if they have at least one subsidiary or branch in the EU. So if any of your companies have a subsidiary or branch in the EU, or you've got a complex corporate structure with a UK parent or a French parent or whatever, but you basically generate money in the EU from that office or subsidiary, you'll be caught with that. But that's just the obligation for yourself to report. The main thing is the indirect effect. Within your international trade, other people, you will be a Scope 3 figure for others, the bigger boys, and they will say, what are your, tell me about your climate action reduction plan. There's different ways to phrase that, your policies, your risks and opportunities. And this actually is a fairly new topic for the majority of the market. But everybody is now included because of this one piece of EU legislation. Next slide, please. Now, this last piece of legislation knocked me for six when I started reading about it. I went, wow, this is a big one. When I looked at the topic, I thought, oh, a due diligence directive, does that mean it just applies to transactions? No, it's a due diligence duty for your own impact. So double materiality, not just your impact yourselves, but your impact on the planet. But they've included both human rights and environmental impacts. So basically the two real baddies that can happen in practice, you know, the big polluters and the people that don't give a monkeys and how they treat people. And they're trying to basically protect both those things. So there's a duty to identify and prevent actual and potential human rights and environmental impacts for your own operations, for your subsidiaries, that can be EU, it could be anywhere, and your whole international supply chain. And it's an annual obligation. And you have to publish it on your website that you've complied with this. So what happens if you don't comply? Well, your contractual relationship can be terminated. There will be a legal trigger for that. So it's not just mandatory, it'll be legal. Then people will be watching you, not just your competitors, but the NGOs, the Greenpeaces, the Client Earth, all these people that want to improve and hold people to account, and they will have 5 years to bring a claim. There's no hiding. Then on the regulatory side, they'll have these new things called supervising authorities. They can name and shame. That could knock a whole whack off your share value. and they can levy fines of up to 5% of the net worldwide turnover. This may be the first time you've heard of this piece of legislation. So when's it coming in? Well, the draft proposal, the proposal came out in 2022, and people thought, oh, maybe it won't get through the Parliament. It's been going between the three big institutions in the EU a couple of times round the block, and there was political agreement on it just before Christmas. That means it's very likely to be coming in as a directive this year. They will give certain grace periods, but like the previous directive, it includes both EU companies and non-EU companies. Then the second thing to note about this, the last thing, sorry, is there's different rules for high impact sectors. Textiles, clothing, footwear, food manufacture, agriculture, construction, some pretty big sectors here, and mineral extraction. And the rules change of the amount of employees, the time scale, and the turnover threshold. So you will hear a lot about this. But as I said at the start, it effectively goes back to governance. There's actually talk of having a director liability. So the big boss of your company, right at the top of the parent, could be personally liability if they do not incorporate this. Nothing changes behavior more than the threat of the big boss having to go to court or be named and shamed. So this will have huge effect. Next slide, please. Now, right at the start, when I said I was trying to improve environmental performance and only the manufacturing companies really got it, all of you guys and ladies know that there are clear benefits of environmental improvements. This same thing happened with ISO 14001, which you probably all have, but the same thing applies to your new or existing and improving net zero strategy. We all need to get one. And when you're going for tenders or keeping your existing clients, they will say, let me see your environmental policy, your climate policy, your reduction targets, your transition plan, your supply chain strategy. They might even ask for carbon literacy training. Next slide, please. So as I said, I've only joined Irwin Mitchell 4 months, and I'm really, really impressed at their own approach to sustainability, but also how we as a law firm can use our influence to help as many companies as possible, because it's not really every man for himself. It's a collective thing for the good of the planet. So we have come up with this, I won't sell it, but basically we've got a service. If you're just right at the start or, haven't even done anything or want slight improvements, we basically hold the hands of any size of company, but mostly SMEs, and make sure at the end of it, you have a collection of documentation that will strengthen your tenders, help you win work, and basically have all those improvements in the last slide. It's a no-brainer to me, but there you go. And next, I think that's the end of my talk. Now, that leads very, very well into Craig, because basically he's been asked within his business to look at the same topic. How do you do it? And he will tell you about his journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. Okay, so I'm just going to talk for about 10 minutes really about how Yamazaki Mazak actually took on the environmental strategy. We started our journey towards an environmental policy many years ago. The factories all over, particularly in the UK, but all over Europe, apply ISO 14001 and similar strategies throughout the rest of the world. But our real large-scale global policy was born actually back probably only in 2020. And that grew out of a very clear message from our Japanese top management. That message wasn't really born out of any stringent global policies or global demands. It was grown out of the fact that we are a family-owned business, and the Japanese top management, reading about the impact of the environment, said this was the right thing to do. Now, obviously, as a senior manager at Mazak and looking after European sales engineering, this fell quite largely into my lap, and we had to start then looking at European policies and trying to understand how we made some sense and navigated our way through to actually making some actions towards climate change and reduction in our carbon footprint. Now, I've got to say at the beginning of the process, it was quite a confusing thing to look at. There's lots of information. There's a minefield of information, but there's nothing, or there wasn't back in 2020, anything that was really that clear to us. The only clear factor, the only piece of information that we came across time and time again was continuously bringing us back to something called the greenhouse gas protocol, which I know Keith has already mentioned. And that, just in about every piece of environmental legislation, is kind of the main authority, the main piece of information that allows you to break down your carbon footprint. So we looked at how we could measure in that way. Now, I'm just going to explain a little bit about this slide. So Mazak actually born two policies, two statements that I'll go into in a minute. But one of the things that we had to sort of understand very quickly was that all of this information obviously leads out of the Paris Agreement, out of the various COP summits, and lots of governments in Europe and around the world made lots of promises. But in the early stages, we didn't see very many policies. So back in 2020, we had to make some assumptions. And those assumptions were that carbon reduction eventually will be incentivized in some way, and overuse of carbon will probably be taxed or enforced. And I think what Keith's just gone through is a clear result of that kind of thinking. We do know that we're expected to measure our carbon footprint or our environmental impact for the foreseeable future. This is something that's now set in stone and will be how companies have to manage this type of policy going forwards. Okay, could you pass to the next slide, please? So we started looking at how this would actually have an impact on Mazak. And we actually started quite at a similar time in noticing a slight change in some of our customer behaviour. As a big organisation that makes a lot of machine tools, we were actually starting to be asked by some of our bigger customers how we could measure our carbon footprint and how they could measure their carbon footprint. And the reason of this becomes apparent, obviously, within Keith's presentation. Our customers, who are suppliers to other big customers, are starting to want to measure their scope 3 so that they can pass the information on to the organisations that they supply. So this chain action over the scope 3 assessment of suppliers needing to inform their customers, who need to inform their customers, to give this whole carbon footprint or the complete product life cycle that the scope 3 will encompass. Now, we started to measure some of our own impacts. We started looking at production of one of our key machines. So one of our key machines, the CO2 footprint for that is about 5.8 tonnes, which is interestingly about the same as a medium-sized family car in its production. What we quickly realised, though, as an organisation, was for us to make a significant impact, it wasn't just about us reducing our own scope 1, scope 2 footprint. It was really about how we could look at designing our machines to reduce our customers' scope 2. So, of course, looking at scope 3 commitments and trying to understand our supply chain impact will have an effect. But we very quickly realised that the biggest environmental impact we could have was to actually develop our machines to reduce their energy consumption and to have a big impact on our customers' scope 2. Can you pass over to the next slide, please? So we set two quite clear goals. Our goal was to actually reduce our carbon footprint by 50% in relation to, based on measurements from 2010. We very clearly state that these are based on 2010. You'll see a lot of organisations make this kind of claim without putting a benchmark date in, it's very difficult to kind of justify that kind of target if you don't have a base point from that. And then the other interesting target we made really affects the scope 2 of our customer scope 2 measurements. And this was to actually make our machines 4 times more environmentally efficient compared to 2010. The first thing, of course, we had to do was find methods of actually measuring this. So we quickly developed a product, we quickly developed products and options on machines so that we could actually measure the machine's energy consumption as it was producing parts, so that this information could be passed to our customers. And you can see there we're able to produce parts and actually then report on the energy cost and the CO2 consumption. And then we give an equivalent kilometre mileage in that, because obviously kilograms of CO2 doesn't make a lot of sense to most people. Okay, can you pass on to the next slide? So you can see from this slide, looking at those 2 targets, we started really looking at how we could change the design of our machines and what changes we could make to the engineering of those machines to reduce the energy consumption. So there's things like looking at the high energy consumption parts like the chiller units, looking at hydraulic units, making sure we're using inverters for our coolant systems, reducing the overall footprint of our machines, having power saving modes and LED lighting, and actually increasing the cut-in efficiency of the machines themselves. So putting these kinds of design targets into our design process meant that some of our newer machines, our Neo range, we've actually reduced the CO2 impact of those machines by as much as 22%. So actual measurements from machining parts. But of course, in our market sector, this was a really tough thing to do without very, very clear legislation or clear guidance. And even up till this point, how you actually measure the energy consumption of a machine tool is widely unpublicized. It's not something that's a very rigid method or something you can do and compare like for like between competitors or between different manufacturers. We actually had to come up with our own methodology of measuring the energy consumption of a machine. So if I pass over again to the next slide. You can see up in the top right-hand corner there, there's a component. So this is a component that we actually found. It was started as a German university project. We've adapted that particular component. It's a 3-axis component, and we actually machined that with our new machines. And we machine it with a specific strategy so that we can actually measure the amount of energy that the machine uses in the production of that single part. And we use that to assess our machines one against the other. So you can see that's actually having an impact on our customers' scope 2 by bringing down the energy consumption of their machines in production of parts. So obviously, as a large organization, we also measure our scope 1 and our scope 3. We're looking at strategies to measure that. Obviously, for large companies, it's a very complex thing to start doing, to start being able to look at the supply chain in detail and measure scope 3 is very difficult to do. But again, our impact being that knowing that the scope 2, reducing our customers' scope 2 is the biggest organizational impact we can have, which is where we've focused our time and energy at the moment. I think that concludes the snippet of information I wanted to give. So I'll pass back to Claire, I think, who's going to take any questions.
Thank you both. I must say that it's been really interesting, but also that I do know that Keith Davidson's name is actually Keith Davidson and not Keith Mitchell, who I introduced him to at the beginning. That was a complete brain freeze moment. So anyway, he is a very valued colleague of mine. I thought I'd just clarify that. But are there any questions from the attendees? We've not had any in the chat. If anybody wants to raise their hand and come on screen, please do so as well. But I have a question, I suppose a question for both Greg and Keith, is what is the one piece of advice that you have for people to get going on this journey? So I'll come over to Keith first.
Well, start right away if you haven't, because you could lose your next job. It's as simple as that. It is that critical. Environmental performance has gone right to the top of the tree. As I said, for every meeting we're now doing, it's ESG, it's the accountants, it's the funders, it's the whole international supply chain. It is the hottest topic, and that's why we could have picked loads of topics to talk about, but this is the one thing that impacts everybody. And it's also why I brought in the slides about the climate and nature crisis, because that is actually what's behind all this. And at the end of the day, we're all doing our job, trying to do the best, etc., etc. But it's a huge issue for society, and we're right at the front. And my advice is try to make as many opportunities out of this topic as possible.
That's really, really great advice, because obviously those slides are clear demonstrations of what we can see is obviously the biodiversity decline rapidly coming, and obviously then the depiction of the climate heating up. You're seeing such a quick, a speedier transition. Those heating up events are coming thick and fast, as opposed to at the beginning part of the slide, and when the climate change or the climate was being tracked. Obviously you've got bigger periods of time where it was cooler, but it seems that those heating periods are coming thick and fast.
Yeah, and there's an issue that, we'll all have noticed this, but I call it the swampy effect. When I first saw people saying save the planet, it was people on the extremes that looked like the great unwashed, and it was really bad for the environmental movement. And their heart was in the right place. Their message was actually correct, but they were ignored. And the big change is now boards of directors who are saying the same thing. And for me as an environmental lawyer, it's great. And I just think it's a double win. You can do your bit for the planet and for biodiversity, but you can also help make money and make your company stronger. So that's why we're focusing everything on this.
That is true, and that obviously leads nicely into, Greg, from your point of view. Obviously, you've taken some really great steps towards producing goods that are helping you meet with your scope emissions, but obviously also helping your clients meet theirs. So what was the key first step for you, and what would you advise another organisation in your position to take that forward?
I think I can mirror a lot of what Keith said, actually. A little bit of a joke I usually make at the beginning of any presentation I do on this within the organisation or outside is usually start by saying, before I go on talking about the environment, I'm not swampy with a haircut. I do actually, I am an engineer, and it's a topic now that's not just covered by green activists or people that have just got environmental awareness. I think the key element for all organisations is to realise that environmental awareness is an aspect of every single person's job. There isn't a necessity just to have one group of people that look after the environmental awareness for the company. It's a little bit like health and safety. It should be something that everybody does, or everybody has an awareness right through the organisation. And that then makes the job of the people that are directing those organisations and passing the information on that much easier.
Craig, you would think that we'd practice this joint presentation in advance, but you've led absolutely beautifully up onto my next point, which is actually as part of our kind of net zero readiness assessment. A big element of that is carbon literacy training. Now, it's not just for your sustainability team or your facilities. It's like for a senior manager, it's for anybody that is interested. And effectively, it's not just climate change awareness, but it's bringing the practical side into it. And what we do that makes it slightly more interesting with our training is we have got the legislation drivers, the mandatory reporting bit behind it. That is actually the reason for these big changes in practice.
Yeah, great.
Great stuff.
I think there's a question actually.
Yeah, Stefan?
Yes, hello. Hi, good morning. My name is Stefan Schwarz. I'm actually the marketing manager, Allied Machine and Engineering. Gregory, we actually have lots of Mazak machines in our manufacturing facility over in Dover, Ohio. I think the challenge that I personally see for us as a global business is to overcome the what's the phrase? What's the word I'm going to use? The hesitance, the resistance almost into going green. It's this typical, I think, no offense to anyone, it's this typical old white man thinking, you know, yeah, we are good. You know, we don't need to do that. You know, there's no global warming. There's no this. There's no that. And the investment, if we need to go green, you know, there is a lot of, we're talking millions of investment. We haven't got that money. We haven't got this. We haven't got that. That is something that hopefully I'm not the only person who experiences that, but a lot of SMEs, a lot of businesses, no matter what size, need to overcome. And that is the challenge over this year or in this year and over the next couple of years. I personally feel, and I basically have started to ask questions quite a number of years ago, because the problem I personally see from the marketing point of view is going into the market as a global leader rather than following competitors. You know, that's something that I'm thriving. That's something that I am driving, or at least I try to drive. But again, it's the barrier of cost. It's the barrier of, well, we don't need to do that. Not at the moment. Let's see what other businesses do. That is the problem I personally see. And I don't know whether you guys, ladies and gentlemen, see that in your own business as well. Thank you very much.
Can I make a couple of comments on that? I think it's a really important point that's been made there. And one of the things that we see as we go out, particularly to our European customer base at the moment, is there's two types of customer. There's the customers that are really interested in this information and really want to do the right thing, and then there are those that really aren't worried. The only impact this is having on them is actually their energy bill. But what we have seen more recently, certainly in the last 12 to 18 months, is there being a lot of benefits of actually flying the environmental flag and doing the right thing. So there are opportunities being opened up with organisations, with particularly large aerospace style organisations, where investment will only be made with organisations with clear energy or clear CO2 carbon reporting directives, and showing that they're doing the right thing. So as much as I do agree, there are costs associated with carbon reporting, there are costs associated with reducing your carbon footprint. Like all of the best policies, there's also a lot of opportunities derived from those as well to gain new customers and gain new products and new offerings.
Yeah, that was a very good comment on this whole challenge. I personally have seen, just because I really wanted this to happen for so long and saw no action, and it was only really the more proactive companies that very early put on proud to be green kind of message, and they got slagged a bit, but they were proven right. The big change is now there's legislation that's going to kick you in the bum if you don't do it. And I mentioned in the last one, which is basically third-party organizations can watch you. You could have greenwash claims if your ESG report isn't correct, etc. The regulatory people can fine you, and you can have your contract terminated. So it actually isn't anymore a nice to have. You have to do it now. And really the reason we did the getting started service is because it's new to so many people. If you take the wrong direction at the start, you will waste money with some consultancy that's going to try and charge you everything for anything. And my big kind of warning is try and stay clear of the big accountancy firms if you can. Now, some of the big companies have to for actually doing their accounting drafting, but for all the additional services, you will be fleeced if you go there. So there's a lot of free stuff. One of my tips would be check out the Carbon Trust. They've got a lot of advice and assistance on Scope 3, and also get your sustainability managers to speak to others in the sector to pick up tips. That has saved us money. That was a waste of money. As I say, there's more collective angle to this where we can all help each other.
I mean, that's certainly true, isn't it? I mean, there's always obviously a premium for those who go first and those first implementers and innovators in any kind of new market or venture. But Greg, finally, just one quick question about, obviously, your organisation is a global manufacturer leading in this sector, but what advice do you have for SMEs on how they can really deliver? Because they might not have a sustainability manager, say, for example. And it's always one of those, isn't it, that when it's a small business and they're really trying to do their best, but actually it's not a full-time job for them to manage sustainability or climate change or their environmental emissions. They're really just trying to deliver the product to the client. So what advice can you give to SMEs in a similar position that's wanting to start out on their sustainability journey?
I think the clearest piece of advice I can give is to become a FA with the basics of the greenhouse gas protocol. I think that's one fundamental thing that doesn't change regardless of which organisation you look to, regardless of which government is actually trying to introduce policies. That's the foundation of the measurement. And then for small companies, to be honest, it's not that different to large companies. The best way to be proactive in this is to talk to each other about it. So find other similar organisations to yourselves, even competitors can talk together on this forum and learn from each other about how to make a difference. And I think that's the critical thing. It's all about research, understanding. And I think Keith's touched on, just be very cautious of working with lots of organisations. You can search on the internet. There's a huge number of organisations that will offer advice. Just make sure you're read up on those organisations, have taken some advice before you start linking with them.
Yeah, and on that, what Craig was mentioning about the greenhouse gas protocol, if you don't have a copy of this, it should be one of your main things that you keep in your locker. It's the corporate value chain Scope 3 accounting and reporting standard that sets out internationally the best practice and how to approach this very important topic.
Excellent.
Okay.
Well, if there are no more questions from the audience, I think we're going to wrap this up for today. But thank you to Keith Davidson and Greg Cox for joining today. Hopefully you found this really interesting. I certainly have. I think with all of these things, even though, you know, we are practitioners in this area, you always learn new things on every presentation, especially when we have people from the sector and the industry presenting and giving us real life examples. So thank you so much, Greg, for that. And I'll say thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you to Keith and Greg. And I think that's the end of today's session.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, MTA. Bye-bye.